There is a kind of exhaustion that only those who have worked hard their entire lives, and still find themselves short at the end of every month, can truly recognize. It is the exhaustion of waking up with a to-do list and going to bed with guilt, of giving everything and somehow never arriving, of watching others seem to move forward while something invisible holds the same place, the same numbers, the same ceiling, of trying harder, cutting more, sacrificing sleep and rest and pleasure, and still feeling like financial freedom is a destination that belongs to someone else. Not because of laziness, not because of wrong choices alone, but because something buried far beneath the surface keeps reconstructing the same financial reality, no matter what changes on the outside. How many times has that quiet despair settled in, the feeling that no matter what is tried, the numbers simply refuse to change? The first time the teachings of Neville Goddard were encountered, something in the mind resisted, because they said something that no financial course, no wealth seminar, no budgeting app had ever dared to say. They said that the outer world of money, of income, of opportunity, is not the cause of a person's financial condition. It is the effect of something far more interior, a set of invisible assumptions that the mind holds about what is possible, what is deserved, and what the identity of this particular person allows. This is not an abstract spiritual comfort. It is a precision teaching about how human experience is actually assembled. And once that understanding lands, really lands, it becomes impossible to look at a bank balance the same way again. Because behind every number there is a belief, and behind every belief there is a state of consciousness that decided what was real before the money ever moved. There are people who have prayed for financial change, who have visualized abundance, who have repeated the affirmations, and still nothing shifted in any lasting way. That experience is not proof that these things do not work, it is proof that something deeper was never touched. One of the most powerful lessons learned from reading Neville Goddard's teachings is the distinction between wanting something and being something, and how radically different those two states are in their creative power. Wanting more money keeps a person in the position of someone who does not have it. Being someone for whom financial abundance is a natural and expected reality, that is an entirely different inner posture, and it produces entirely different results. The outer world does not respond to wishes, it responds to states, to the deep background assumptions that a person carries without even realizing they are carrying them. And the single most powerful of those assumptions, the one that, when changed, changes everything, is the one that has never once been questioned. What is the story that lives in the quiet between one thought and the next, the unspoken verdict about money, about worth, about what kind of life is actually available? Not the version of the story that sounds good in conversation, not the aspirational version, but the raw and honest one that surfaces as a feeling in the chest when the subject of financial freedom arises. That feeling, the tightness, the distant sense that abundance is for others, is not a reflection of reality. It is the creator of reality. This is what Neville Goddard meant when he spoke of the law of assumption. The world mirrors back, with extraordinary precision, the inner state that is being assumed as true. Every financial wall ever encountered, every door that opened just a little and then closed, every moment of near breakthrough that somehow reversed, each of these had the same architect. Not the economy. Not bad timing. The assumption. There is a difference between knowing, intellectually, that mindset matters, and discovering, with genuine shock, the specific belief that has been running the entire financial story from behind the scenes. Most people stay at the intellectual level, nodding at the idea that consciousness shapes reality without ever going deep enough to find the thought that has been doing the most damage. One of the lessons learned from studying Neville Goddard's teachings is that consciousness is not just a factor in the financial equation, it is the equation itself, the only variable that matters at the deepest level. The circumstances, the job, the economy, these are the printout, not the program. And if the program running beneath the surface still carries the signature of someone who is not meant to be free, someone for whom money is struggle, not flow, then every external change will eventually conform to that inner verdict. What would it mean to finally locate that program, to read its code with clear eyes, and to understand exactly how it was written and when? That is the kind of inquiry that changes a life, not the surface kind, not the kind that lasts a weekend, but the deep and irreversible kind that begins the moment a person stops blaming the world and starts reading the inner architecture that built it. The assumption that money is difficult, that it requires suffering, that it belongs to a specific kind of person and that person is not who one is, does not announce itself loudly. It whispers. It hides in hesitations. It lives in the half-second of doubt before an opportunity is pursued and then quietly abandoned. It shows up as the voice that says, "This probably won't work for me," before a single step has been taken. It dressed itself, long ago, in the clothing of realism, of being practical, of not getting hopes up, of protecting against disappointment. And because it wore that disguise so well, it was never recognized as a belief. It was accepted as the truth. Neville Goddard's teachings make clear that no external condition has any power that was not first granted by an internal assumption. No shortage exists without a prior acceptance of shortage as personal reality. This is not blame. This is liberation, because what was assumed without choice can be replaced by assumption made consciously. Bruce Lipton, whose research into epigenetics revealed something the scientific community took decades to accept, described the subconscious mind as a tape player, running programs recorded in early childhood, long before any critical thinking was available to question them. His findings showed that 95% of human behavior, including financial behavior, is governed by these background programs rather than by conscious intention or desire. This means that a person can want abundance with every conscious fiber and still unconsciously operate from a script that says abundance is not available to people like them. This is not weakness. This is biology meeting belief, a combination so powerful it shapes entire lifetimes without ever being examined. What Lipton described in the language of science, Neville Goddard had already described in the language of consciousness. The inner state always wins over the outer intention. Always. Without exception. The inner always outlasts the outer strategy. And the doorway out is not more effort. It is a different assumption, held with the same certainty that the old one was held for decades. There is a reason why two people can start from nearly identical circumstances and arrive at completely different financial realities. Same city, same opportunities, same economic climate, and one moves through expanding abundance while the other stays circling the same limitations. The difference is rarely found in their actions alone. It is found in what they assume, at the level of feeling, to be inevitable for them. One person carries, beneath all the effort, a deep and unquestioned sense that they are someone for whom things work out, that financial ease is a reasonable expectation. The other carries, with equal conviction and equal invisibility, the sense that struggle is simply the price of being who they are. Both are obeying the same law. Both are receiving exactly what they have assumed. And the law does not judge which assumption is being offered, it simply reflects, with perfect accuracy, whatever is held most consistently in the depths of the inner world. Here is the image that makes this undeniable: a thermostat set at a certain temperature. The room may change, windows open, seasons shift, a fire is lit, but the thermostat always brings the room back to the number it was programmed to hold. Financial reality operates exactly this way. Windfalls arrive and are mysteriously spent, income increases but expenses rise to match, opportunities appear but something always comes up to prevent them from being taken. Not because life is unfair, but because the internal thermostat, the deeply assumed financial setpoint, keeps pulling everything back to the familiar temperature. One of the most jarring lessons learned from reading Neville Goddard's teachings is this: it is not enough to change the money, the thermostat itself must be changed. The setpoint, the assumed financial identity, the quiet internal verdict about what is normal, that is what must shift, and when it shifts, the outer world has no choice but to follow. Is it possible that every financial ceiling ever encountered was not imposed from the outside, but built from the inside, installed so long ago it was mistaken for the natural height of the room? The contrast between how most people approach financial change and how this understanding reframes everything is almost disorienting the first time it lands. The conventional path says, work harder, earn more, save differently, and eventually the outer world will reward enough effort with freedom. This path is not wrong, but it is incomplete, because it leaves the most powerful variable untouched, the assumption sitting beneath all the effort like a hidden foundation. A person can spend an entire lifetime rearranging the furniture of their financial reality without ever questioning the house that assumption quietly built around them. They can hustle, optimize, and sacrifice, and still feel the strange gravity of a set point pulling every gain back toward the familiar and the small. What Neville Goddard's teachings propose is not the abandonment of action, but its transformation, action that flows from a new assumption, from an inner state that has already accepted abundance as its natural condition. Is there a readiness, somewhere inside, to stop fighting the outer world and start changing the one thing that was always creating it? The belief that keeps financial freedom at a distance rarely announces itself in dramatic language. It does not usually sound like, "I will never be wealthy." That would be too easy to catch and confront directly. Instead, it sounds like, "Money is complicated," or people like me have to work twice as hard for half as much, or simply, I have never been good with money. It sounds reasonable. It sounds inherited, absorbed from a parent, collected from a neighborhood, learned from watching how the adults nearby handled, or failed to handle, abundance. These quiet sentences have been rehearsed so many times, across so many situations, that the mind long ago stopped treating them as opinions and began treating them as facts. And a mind that treats a limitation as a fact will never seriously search for the door out of it, because facts, unlike beliefs, are not supposed to be questioned. What if the most financially limiting thing ever encountered was not a circumstance at all, but a sentence, a single inherited sentence that has been believed without examination for years? There is an ancient text that cuts through all of this with a precision that feels almost unsettling, and it is found in Proverbs, chapter 23, verse 7. It reads, "For as he thinketh in his heart, so is he." 6 words, and within those 6 words, a complete map of how human reality is assembled. For as he thinketh, not as he wishes, not as he prays, not as he tries, not even as he labors, but as he genuinely and deeply assumes in the privacy of his own inner world. In his heart, not in the surface of the mind where intentions and rehearsed affirmations reside, but in the heart, where the oldest and most settled convictions make their home without asking for permission. So is he, not so will he eventually become, not so might he one day be, but so is he, present tense, right now, as a living and operational reality. This verse is not a spiritual metaphor to be appreciated from a distance. It is a precise description of the law that governs financial life, and every other dimension of human experience. Neville Goddard built an entire body of teaching on the foundation of that single principle, that the inner assumption is not a passive background to life but its active creator. The heart, in this ancient understanding, is not the emotional center of sentiment. It is the seat of conviction, the place where what is truly believed, not what is wished, lives and operates without interruption. And what lives in that deepest chamber is what is continuously being broadcast into the world as experience. For someone whose heart holds the assumption, "I am someone who struggles financially," that assumption is not waiting for conditions to confirm it. It is actively generating those conditions, right now. This is the law of Proverbs chapter 23, verse 7, working not against a person but through them, expressing, with complete obedience, whatever has been placed in the heart as real. The question this verse quietly demands is not, "What do I want?" It is, "What do I genuinely believe I am, when nothing is performing and no one is watching?" Because that, and only that, is the belief that is building the financial reality being lived in this very moment. The I am, those 2 words woven throughout ancient texts and throughout the teachings of Neville Goddard, is not merely a name. It is a declaration of state, a creative announcement of what consciousness has accepted as its own identity and therefore as its own reality. I am not the kind of person who experiences financial freedom, whispered in the inner world dozens of times each day, never spoken aloud, is not a neutral observation. It is a command, and experience obeys it with the same faithfulness that it would obey any other deeply held assumption. Every financial ceiling, when traced carefully enough back through the years, leads to one of these inner declarations, an I am statement installed without permission and left unchallenged because it was dressed as common sense. One of the most liberating discoveries available in Neville Goddard's teachings is this: the I am was never fixed, it only felt that way because no one explained that it could be consciously redirected. The same law that constructed the limitation also contains the instruction for its dissolution, and the instruction is always a new assumption about who one already is. What changes when the assumption changes is not only the feeling, it is the entire field of what becomes possible to perceive, pursue, and receive. A person carrying a genuine inner assumption of financial ease begins to notice opportunities that were always present but invisible from inside the old belief, like a frequency that could not be heard because the receiver was tuned elsewhere. Decisions shift. Conversations shift. The way the body carries itself in rooms where money is discussed shifts, not because abundance was performed, but because something at the core actually moved. The thermostat was reset, and the whole system began operating at a new temperature, drawing different circumstances toward it the way a different field attracts different particles. This is what Neville Goddard pointed to when describing the state of consciousness that has already accepted its desired reality as done, not a technique to be applied, but a shift to be inhabited. And when that shift occurs at the level of the heart, at the level described in Proverbs chapter 23, verse 7, the outer world begins to conform with a specificity that startles even those who understood the principle. Is there a willingness, somewhere in this moment, to consider that the financial story being lived right now is not a verdict delivered by life, but a reflection of an assumption that can, starting here, be replaced with something true? The practical application of what Proverbs chapter 23, verse 7 describes begins not with affirmation but with honest examination. Before a new assumption can be planted, the old one must be found, not to be judged or condemned, but to be seen clearly for the first time. This is what the teachings of Neville Goddard always pointed toward, not the bypassing of a painful belief, but the precise identification of it, because a belief that is truly seen loses half of its power in that very moment of recognition. The practice is deceptively simple: to sit in stillness and ask, without flinching, what is actually being assumed about financial identity at the deepest level available. Not what is hoped, not what is worked toward. What is genuinely assumed, in the unguarded basement of the inner world, to be permanently and irreversibly true. When that belief surfaces, and it will, because the heart does not lie when approached with patience, something remarkable becomes available. For the first time, the architect of the financial story is no longer invisible, and what can be seen clearly can, at last, be changed. Neville Goddard described the method of changing assumptions with a phrase that is easy to hear and genuinely difficult to execute: feel the wish fulfilled. Not think it. Not intellectually agree with it. Not perform it for an audience. Feel it, from the inside, as a genuine state of being, as a settled reality that needs no external confirmation before it is accepted as real. This is the distinction that separates those who engage this principle and see results from those who engage it and wonder why nothing in the outer world ever moves. A person can repeat the words, "I am financially free," 1,000 times with their voice, while every fiber of the body continues transmitting the old signal of scarcity, and the outer world reads the signal, not the words. What the law responds to is state, the felt sense of who one is, the background emotional posture held without needing to be consciously maintained. One of the most precise lessons available from reading Neville Goddard's teachings is this: the assumption must be inhabited the way one inhabits a room, sitting inside it, breathing its air, feeling its walls as already real. That inhabitation, that inner residency in a new financial identity, is where transformation stops being a concept and starts becoming the architecture of an entirely new life. And yet, this is exactly where most people who have encountered this principle stumble, not because they are not sincere, but because the old assumption fights back. The body, conditioned by years of financial tension, sends signals of doubt the moment a newer and more expansive state is attempted. The mind, trained to treat those signals as trustworthy information, translates them immediately into evidence that the new assumption is not real, and retreats back to the familiar and the small. Neville Goddard named this challenge precisely: persisting in the assumption despite what the senses report, holding the inner truth steady even as the outer reality continues, for a time, to reflect the old pattern. This is not spiritual bypassing, it is an accurate understanding of the sequence in which real change occurs: inner first, outer second, always, without exception. The seed is placed in the ground before the harvest appears, the foundation is laid before the house stands, the assumption is inhabited before the circumstances reorganize themselves to match it. Knowing this sequence, and trusting it during the gap between the inner shift and its outer expression, is what determines whether the change persists long enough to become visible. The validation offered here matters. The pain of years spent giving everything and still feeling financially trapped is real, and it deserves to be honored rather than dismissed. Nothing in this understanding suggests that the struggle was invented, or that the suffering was conscious, or that blame belongs to the person who simply absorbed the beliefs of their environment before they had any tools to question them. The beliefs were inherited. The conditioning was not chosen. The financial story was written in chapters that arrived before the author was old enough to hold the pen. What is being offered is not the verdict, "You caused this." It is something far more important: you hold more power to change this than anyone in your life has ever told you. That is a completely different thing, not a condemnation of the past, but a genuine and open invitation into a different relationship with everything still to come. The "I am" that was handed to each person at the start of life was never the final word on what was possible. It was only the opening sentence of a story that has always had more pages left to write. How different might every tomorrow begin to look, if starting from this exact moment, the assumption running in the background of every financial decision quietly became something new. The empowerment available in this understanding is not the loud and brittle kind that collapses the first time the outer world pushes back. It is the quiet and structural kind, the kind that changes the foundation of what is being assumed, so that even when circumstances offer evidence of the old story, the inner world no longer accepts that evidence as the final verdict. This is what Neville Goddard's teachings offer at their deepest level. Not motivation, but architecture, a completely different understanding of the relationship between consciousness and the financial experience it is continuously creating. When a person genuinely shifts their assumed financial identity, not performing abundance but inhabiting it, not pretending but truly reassigning the I am, something in the field of their life begins to quietly reorganize. Doors that were never noticed begin to appear. Conversations that seemed impossible begin to happen. Resources that felt inaccessible begin arriving through channels that the logic of effort alone could never have predicted or planned. Not because something magical intervened from the outside, but because a new assumption created a new person, and that new person, moving through the very same world, moves through it with entirely different eyes, hands, and expectations. Is there something real and present, somewhere inside this moment, that feels ready to begin assuming a different financial identity, not as a distant goal, but as a quiet and persistent inner truth starting now? When the assumption shifts, genuinely shifts, at the level of the heart rather than the surface of the mind, the changes that follow are not always dramatic at first. They begin small, and this is precisely why they are often missed or dismissed before they are allowed to grow. A different opportunity is noticed where before there was only routine. A conversation unfolds in a way that opens something that had been closed for years. A resource arrives from an unexpected direction and is accepted instead of instinctively deflected. These are not coincidences. They are the first responses of a world that has begun to receive a different signal. One of the most illuminating lessons available from reading Neville Goddard's teachings is that the outer world does not change all at once. It changes the way dawn comes, gradually, then undeniably. The person who is alert to these early shifts, who recognizes them as confirmation of the new assumption rather than accidents, strengthens the new state with each recognition. And that strengthening accelerates the process in a way that logic alone could never predict, because the inner and the outer are always in conversation, always calibrating to meet each other. There is a weight that comes with this understanding, a beautiful and serious weight, because it removes the possibility of remaining comfortably passive in the face of an unwanted financial reality. Once it is understood that the assumption is the architect, a new kind of responsibility arrives that cannot be returned, the responsibility of tending the inner world with the same seriousness that effort was once given to the outer one. This does not mean perfection. It does not mean that every fearful thought must be immediately hunted and eliminated. It means developing a practice of returning, of noticing when the old assumption has quietly reasserted itself and choosing, with patience rather than force, to come back to the new one. This is what conscious creation looks like from the inside. Not a one-time decision, but an ongoing orientation, a continuous and gentle returning to the state that has been chosen as true. Neville Goddard described this as persistence, the willingness to hold the new assumption steady across the gap between its planting and its harvest, even when the outer world offers no visible evidence of growth. And every time that persistence is chosen over the familiar retreat into doubt, the new financial identity becomes one layer more real, one layer more structurally embedded in the consciousness that is quietly building the life. Consider the person who had applied for the same kind of opportunity repeatedly across years, always falling just short, always receiving the same polite and deflating decline. What changed the outcome was not a new strategy or a revised approach on the surface. It was a new inner posture, a quiet decision to stop arriving from a state of unspoken desperation and begin arriving from a genuine assumption of belonging. The outer actions were nearly identical. The inner assumption was completely different. And the results, almost immediately, began to shift in ways that surprised everyone observing from the outside. This is one of the clearest patterns available when studying the accounts of people who applied Neville Goddard's teachings to financial circumstances. The external shift followed the internal one with a consistency that could not be explained by effort or timing alone. It is not that the outer actions became unnecessary. It is that those same actions, taken from a different inner state, produced entirely different responses from the world that received them. The person who walks into a room genuinely assuming they belong there and the person who walks in silently apologizing for their presence can perform identical actions and produce radically different outcomes. Because the world responds not only to what is done, but to what is being assumed about the self that is doing it. Here is the revelation that most financial conversations will never arrive at, because it is too disruptive for a world that prefers to keep people believing that money is primarily an external problem with external solutions. The financial field, the jobs, the markets, the opportunities, is genuinely neutral in a way that is almost impossible to accept from inside a limiting assumption. It does not withhold from specific people. It does not carry preferences. It responds, with quiet and mechanical precision, to the state of consciousness that approaches it. A person approaching the field of financial possibility from a deep assumption of belonging receives a completely different experience of that field than a person approaching it from an assumption of exclusion, and both experiences feel like objective reality, because both are being generated entirely from within. This is the most unsettling and most liberating truth available in this entire understanding. The financial world each person inhabits is a custom experience, shaped by the specific assumption being held in the heart. What feels like how money works is actually how money works for someone carrying this specific inner state, and that specificity is the opening, because it means the experience can be changed from the inside without waiting for the outside to move first. Is there something in this moment willing to accept, fully and without retreat, that the financial story lived until now was never a sentence handed down by life, but a reflection, faithful and precise, of what was quietly assumed to be true? Everything explored here leads to a single practical threshold, the moment when understanding moves from the realm of concept into the realm of lived experience. This threshold is not a dramatic leap. It is a quiet decision, made in the privacy of the inner world, to begin treating a new financial identity as already true, not as a wish to be earned, not as a reward waiting to be received, but as a present-tense reality that has simply not yet fully appeared in the outer world. That decision, made with genuine commitment and revisited daily, is the beginning of the most important financial practice available. Not because it replaces action, but because it transforms what every action is rooted in and therefore what every action produces. The gap between the inner assumption and the outer reality is not a wall, it is a corridor, and every person who has ever genuinely shifted their consciousness has walked through it. Those who walk it most successfully are not those who feel no doubt, but those who feel the doubt and return to the new assumption anyway, again and again, with patience and with growing certainty. There is a practice, concrete, simple, and immediately available, that makes the new assumption real in the body rather than just real in the mind, requiring nothing that is not already present and asking only for honesty and consistency. It begins exactly where every person already is, and it starts with a single, deliberate act of inner reassignment that, when taken seriously, changes what the eyes begin to see in the very same world they have always been looking at. The existential weight of truly accepting that one belief has been governing the entire financial story is not a small thing to sit with. It arrives not as a comfortable insight but as something closer to a quiet earthquake, a realization that rewrites not just the future, but the meaning of everything that came before. Every year of effort suddenly carries a different explanation. Every moment of near success that somehow reversed reveals its real author. And yet, the response that most serves a person in this moment is not grief for the years lived inside the old assumption, but a kind of fierce and grateful clarity about what has now been found. Because a person who has located the source of the obstruction has already done the hardest part. They have found the door in a wall they once believed was solid in every direction. What is on the other side of that door is not guaranteed by hope or by wishful thinking. It is governed by the same precise law that built the wall in the first place, now working in a new direction. And that law has never once failed. It has only ever delivered, with perfect accuracy, exactly what the deepest assumption in the heart declared to be real. There is an image that captures this with a precision that the mind tends to hold long after the words have faded. A river does not struggle to reach the ocean, it does not motivate itself, it does not strategize against its own tendency toward stillness. It flows because flowing is its nature, because something in its deepest structure simply assumes that the ocean exists and that the path toward it is already open. The person who has genuinely changed their assumption about financial identity becomes something like that river, not because the obstacles disappear immediately, but because the internal resistance to flowing dissolves. What was once met with unconscious contraction, opportunities, expansion, abundance, is now met with an organic and unforced openness that changes everything about how the world responds in return. Neville Goddard's teachings always return to this. The outer world is not something to be conquered, it is something to be inhabited, and it is inhabited from within, by the quality of assumption the inner world is willing to carry. The river does not ask the ocean for permission to arrive, it simply flows, and the ocean receives it because that is what has always been true. The body holds the old assumption in places the mind alone cannot reach, in the shoulders, in the breath, in the way the stomach quietly tightens whenever financial topics arise. This is not metaphor, it is biology. The nervous system records every emotionally significant experience and uses those recordings to predict what is coming next, preparing the body accordingly long before any conscious thought has formed. For someone who has lived years inside a financial identity of scarcity, the body itself has become a participant in maintaining that reality, responding to abundance cues with a physiological signature of threat rather than welcome. This is why changing a financial assumption must include the body, must be felt in the flesh, must produce a genuinely different physical signature if it is to be more than an intellectual exercise. When the new assumption is inhabited not just as a thought but as a genuine bodily state, when ease becomes something felt in the chest rather than merely agreed with in the mind, the nervous system begins to be retrained at the very level where the old story was originally stored. The connection between body and belief is not incidental. It is the mechanism by which assumptions become self-sustaining, and it is the mechanism by which new ones take root and eventually replace what was built without permission. The whole person, body, mind, and spirit, aligned in the same direction, carrying the same inner assumption of financial belonging, is not fighting the world. They are in full agreement with the law that was always ready to serve them. The call that comes from genuinely understanding all of this is not to become someone new. It is to return to something original. Because the assumption of limitation was never native, it was installed. It arrived as conditioning, as inheritance, as the absorbed verdict of others who themselves carried wounds they never examined. Beneath all of that conditioning, in the deepest layer of what each person actually is, there was never a statement of lack, only the open and infinite creative capacity that the ancient texts call the I Am, undecorated by limitation. The I Am does not arrive with a financial ceiling built in, does not come with a predetermined income bracket or a predetermined boundary of freedom. It arrives as pure creative potential, and everything limiting ever believed about money was added later, added by the world, added by experience, added by those who did not know they were passing on a wound rather than a truth. The call here is not toward performance or spiritual ambition, but toward a genuine and quiet stripping away of what was installed without consent, until what remains is the version of the I Am that was never meant to carry the belief that financial freedom belonged to someone else. There is a person available from the inside of every life that already inhabits abundance as a natural state, not as a future destination, not as a reward to be earned, but as the present tense expression of who they have always, underneath everything, already been. What comes next is not a theory, it is a threshold. And thresholds, unlike concepts, are not crossed by understanding alone. They are crossed by taking the single step that makes the understanding real in the body and in the daily texture of lived experience. The practice that follows asks for nothing extraordinary. No special equipment, no altered schedule, no performance visible to anyone else in the world. It asks only for one deliberate, honest, and fully committed act of inner reassignment, a moment in which the old financial identity is consciously set down and a new one is consciously chosen, not as a wish but as a present-tense reality. This act, returned to with consistency and met with patience when the old signal resurfaces, as it will, is how the thermostat is actually reset, not just acknowledged from a comfortable distance. Neville Goddard was always clear that transformation is not an event but a practice, a daily return to the new assumption until it becomes the background noise of the inner world, as automatic and as unquestioned as the old one once was. Is there a genuine readiness, felt not just as an idea but as something present in the body in this very moment, to take that single step and begin inhabiting a financial identity that was always available but never before consciously chosen? The practice that brings all of this into the body is simple enough to be dismissed, and powerful enough to change everything if taken seriously. It begins with a single physical object, something small, held easily in the hand, a coin, a key, a stone, carried through an ordinary day without drawing attention. The object holds no power of its own. Its role is entirely practical, which is precisely what makes it effective. Each time it is touched, reaching into a pocket, feeling its weight shift, it becomes a physical anchor back to the new assumption. Not a cue to perform abundance, but a sensory signal to return, for just a moment, to the genuine felt sense of financial ease already present. The body recognizes physical anchors in ways that pure thought does not always reach, and that recognition gives the practice its structural depth. Something felt in the hands and chest, repeated quietly across a full day, gradually becomes a new default signal, and the nervous system begins reorganizing around what it is consistently asked to feel as real. The commitment is not to feel perfect every time the object is touched. The old assumption will surface, and that is expected. The commitment is simply to return, to notice the old signal, acknowledge it without judgment, and choose again the felt sense of the new financial identity. This returning, small, unheroic, entirely private, is the actual work of assumption change, because assumptions are not replaced in single moments but through thousands of quiet returns. By the end of a day of practicing this with genuine presence, something in the inner landscape shifts, not visibly, not noisily, but structurally. After a week of real commitment, the new assumption begins to feel less like something being constructed and more like something being remembered. This is the threshold Neville Goddard always described, where the assumption stops being an act of deliberate will and becomes an act of identity. From that recognition, the outer world, always faithful, always exact, begins to reorganize in ways that confirm what has already been decided in the deepest chamber to be true. For those for whom what has been explored here resonated at a level deeper than the intellectual, for whom something in the body responded before the mind caught up, this exploration continues. Neville Goddard's teachings have a way of revealing new layers each time they are revisited, landing differently because the person receiving them has quietly shifted since the last encounter. Those who remain connected to this work find that the ideas compound, each new understanding reinforcing the ones before, until a different inner architecture has been built without force. If something moved something real today, if a belief was seen clearly that had never been seen before, allowing that movement to continue is one of the most valuable decisions available. The most significant investment a person can make is not in a market or a method, it is in the quality of the assumption they are willing to carry about their own identity. What would the financial story of the next 5 years look like if, beginning now, the deepest assumption about money were consciously chosen rather than unconsciously inherited? Is there a genuine readiness, felt not as a concept but as something alive in the body right now, to find out? Everything explored here, from the first quiet ache of financial exhaustion to the precise mechanics of the law of assumption, arrives at the same singular truth. That truth is not complicated. The financial reality being lived is always, at its deepest level, a portrait of the financial identity being assumed. Not a punishment, not a fixed condition, not a verdict handed down by circumstance, the economy, or the family into which a person was born. A portrait, and like every portrait, it changes the moment the subject consciously inhabits a different truth about who they are. The different truth is not an invention, it is a return to the version of the I am that existed before the world began annotating it with uninvited limitations. That version was never lost, only temporarily obscured by assumptions that were borrowed, never native, and always more about what was absorbed than what was originally true. The portrait has always been capable of being repainted, and the painter has always been the consciousness sitting quietly inside, holding more creative authority than it was ever told it possessed. There was a person described at the very beginning, exhausted, giving everything, still finding the month outlasting the money, carrying a financial ceiling they could not explain or break. That person was never broken, never without power, simply operating from an assumption installed before they had any means to question it, one the world reflected back so consistently it became mistaken for reality. What changes now is not the world, not immediately, but the signal being sent into it, broadcast from the deepest and most creative chamber of the inner life. The law that obeyed the old belief does not retire. It simply redirects with the same precision it always brought to every assumption it ever served. The one belief that kept financial freedom at a distance was never the truth. It was a sentence borrowed from a world that passed along a limitation instead of a map. And the gift buried inside all of this is that the same law that built every wall will, with equal faithfulness, build every open door the moment the assumption genuinely and persistently changes. The exhaustion that opened this journey and the freedom that awaits are not separated by more effort or more time, only by a single shift in what is quietly and unwaveringly assumed, in the deepest place, to be true.